Park thug provokes the black woman, unaware the gentle undercover. Korean Mafia boss sits beside her. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees of Riverside Green Park, painting long shadows across the wooden benches. Joggers passed by in rhythmic strides. Dogs tugged at their leashes. The city hummed at a safe distance, close enough to hear, far enough to forget. Alicia Thompson sat stiffly on a bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, shoulders drawn inward. She had come to the park seeking quiet, seeking space to breathe. Instead, she felt eyes on her, heard laughter that felt too close, too pointed. She wasn't imagining it. "Hey." A voice cut through the peaceful afternoon air, too close, too loud. "You deaf or something?" Alicia turned her head slightly. 4 men stood nearby, hoodies pulled low, caps shadowing their faces, and confidence radiating not from success, but from numbers. The one speaking, Brandon Cole, leaned forward with a pointed finger, as if her attention was something he was owed by right. "I'm talking to you," he continued, his voice edged with mockery. "You gonna answer, or keep acting scared?" Alicia swallowed hard. Years of experience had taught her that tone could escalate situations faster than words ever could. "I'm just sitting here," she said, her voice deliberately calm. "Please leave me alone." In a better world, that would have been enough, but it never was. Brandon laughed, a sharp bark of amusement as he glanced back at his companions, Tyler Reed, Marcus Hill, and Evan Brooks, seeking their validation. "Hear that?" he mocked. "She said please. Real polite." Alicia felt the familiar cocktail of anger and caution flood her system. Her eyes scanned the park, instinctively, desperately. People were around, families, couples, solo walkers, but no one was close enough to intervene. No one was paying attention. No one, except the man sitting beside her. She had barely registered his presence when she'd first sat down. Mid-40s, wearing a neat black jacket, posture relaxed in a way that suggested complete comfort with his surroundings. He held a small takeout container in one hand. Chopsticks paused midair, as if the interruption was merely a mild inconvenience to his lunch. His expression held no fear, but it held no bravado either, only patience. His name was Jun Seok, though no one in Riverside Green Park knew that. Even fewer would know that Jun wasn't just another quiet professional enjoying a peaceful lunch break. He lived carefully, anonymously, by design. His life required it. Brandon stepped even closer to Alicia now, lowering his voice in a way that somehow made the threat feel more personal, more invasive. "You always sit alone like this? Or are you waiting for somebody special?" Before Alicia could formulate a response, Jun finally spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with quiet certainty. "Gentlemen," he said, his eyes still fixed on his food, "you're blocking the walkway." Brandon blinked, momentarily thrown off his script. "What?" Jun looked up then, meeting Brandon's eyes with a calm so complete, so absolute, it felt almost disarming. "You're causing a disturbance in a public park," he said evenly. "People come here to rest." Marcus scoffed from behind Brandon. "Who asked you?" Jun nodded slowly, as if considering the question with genuine thoughtfulness. "No one," he replied. "That's usually how unnecessary problems begin." Tyler laughed, a nervous edge creeping into the sound. "You trying to be a hero or something?" Jun didn't rise to the bait, didn't shift his posture, didn't raise his voice. He simply placed his chopsticks down with deliberate care and wiped his hands with a napkin, each movement measured and unhurried. "I'm suggesting," Jun said, his tone unchanged, "that you leave." There was no threat in his voice, no raised volume, no aggressive body language. And yet something in the atmosphere shifted. Brandon felt it, a subtle imbalance he couldn't quite name. He couldn't explain why this man's stillness unsettled him more than shouting ever could, why the quiet confidence felt more dangerous than any display of force. "You think you scare me?" Brandon snapped, and thrusting a finger inches from Jun's face, trying to reassert dominance through proximity and aggression. Jun glanced at the finger, then slowly raised his eyes back to Brandon's face. "No," he replied calmly. "I think you scare yourself." Alicia held her breath, every muscle in her body tense. Jun stood then, not abruptly, not slowly, but with the precise amount of movement needed to reclaim space. He turned slightly, positioning himself between Alicia and the group, without making physical contact with anyone, his body language clear and unmistakable. "This woman asked to be left alone," he said quietly. That should have ended the conversation. Evan Brooks shifted uncomfortably behind the others, muttering, "Man, this ain't worth it." Brandon hesitated, pride warring visibly with instinct. Something about June felt fundamentally different. Not stronger, necessarily, not louder, just unmovable, like trying to intimidate a mountain. "You don't know who you're talking to," Brandon said, but the words came out weaker than intended, hollow. June gave a faint smile, almost kind in its gentleness. "That's true," he acknowledged, "and neither do you." The distant wail of sirens cut through the park's ambient sounds. Not close, but close enough to remind everyone present that choices had consequences, that public spaces had witnesses, that authority existed beyond this moment. Marcus tugged at Brandon's sleeve. "Let's go," he urged. Brandon stepped backward, his eyes never leaving June's face, searching for something, fear, uncertainty, weakness, and finding nothing. "This ain't over," he muttered, though it sounded more like a line from a movie than a genuine promise. The four men walked away, their laughter forced and brittle, shoulders tight with embarrassed tension. Silence returned to the bench like a blessing. Alicia exhaled shakily, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. "You didn't have to do that." June sat back down, retrieving his chopsticks as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Yes," he said gently. "I did. She studied him now, really looked at him for the first time. You weren't scared." June shrugged, a small economical movement. "Fear is loud," he said simply. "Experience is quiet." Alicia frowned slightly, curiosity replacing her fading adrenaline. "What do you do?" "If you don't mind me asking." June considered the question carefully, as if weighing his words. "I manage people," he said truthfully, though not completely. "I help them make better decisions." She smiled faintly, some of the tension leaving her face. "Well, you helped me today." June nodded. "You helped yourself," he corrected. "You stayed calm. You didn't give them what they wanted." "What was that?" she asked, genuinely curious now. "Reaction," he replied. "Bullies feed on it." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the park resuming its peaceful rhythm around them. Birds called from the trees. A child's laughter rang out from somewhere nearby. Life continued. Finally, Alicia stood, gathering her belongings. "I should go," she said, "but I'm glad you were here." June looked up at her, and something warm and genuine in his expression. "So am I." As she walked away, disappearing into the flow of park visitors, June returned to his lunch, his expression unchanged. To anyone watching, and no one was, he appeared to be just another man on a bench, enjoying a quiet afternoon. No one would guess that June Sock spent his life navigating power structures far more dangerous than four loud men in a park. That his greatest strength wasn't force, but restraint. That his calm came not from innocence, but from experience with situations where the stakes were infinitely higher. Because real power, he knew, didn't need witnesses, and dignity, once protected, spoke for itself. Hello, my friends and loved ones. Thanks for joining me on this beautiful story. As we continue this story, kindly take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Like the video, and I love to always hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it at your end right now? Thank you for subscribing. Alicia's hands remained folded in her lap, but her fingers had begun to press into each other. A small tell, invisible to anyone not paying attention. She was always paying attention. Years of experience had taught her to read rooms, assess threats, calculate exits. This wasn't her first time. At 28, Alicia Thompson had accumulated a mental catalog of moments like this. The grocery store parking lot where a stranger felt entitled to comment on her body. The coffee shop where she'd been called aggressive for asking someone to stop touching her hair. The subway platform where "just smile" had escalated into following her for 3 blocks. Each time, she'd made a choice. Respond or retreat, assert or avoid, fight or flight. Each time, she'd chosen calm. Not because calm came naturally, it didn't, but because she'd learned, painfully, that anger gave people permission to call her exactly what they expected. Threatening, aggressive, difficult. The stereotypes were pre-written. She'd simply be confirming the script, so she'd perfected the art of restraint. kept her voice level, her face neutral, her body language non-threatening even when every instinct screamed to defend herself. The cost of being the calm one was a weight she carried in her shoulders, in the tension that never quite left her jaw, in the exhaustion that came from constant self-monitoring. Today, that weight felt heavier. Brandon shifted his position, moving slightly to his left. Tyler mirrored him to the right. A casual repositioning, except it wasn't casual at all. They were boxing her in, claiming space, reducing her options. The walkway that had felt open moments ago now felt compressed, their presence creating invisible walls. "You're not very friendly, are you?" Brandon said, his tone shifting to mock concern. "We're just trying to be nice." Marcus chuckled. "Yeah, just being neighborly." The gaslighting was almost impressive in its speed. Within seconds, her request to be left alone had been reframed as her being unfriendly, their harassment repackaged as neighborliness. Alicia's eyes moved across the park, a quick survey disguised as casual observation. A woman in yoga pants power-walked past, earbuds in, eyes forward, deliberately unseeing. An elderly couple sat on a bench 30 feet away. The man glanced over, noticed the situation. Nia then looked pointedly at his newspaper. A jogger slowed, seemed to consider stopping, then picked up pace and continued past. The message was clear. This was her problem to solve. She'd seen this pattern before. The collective decision that intervening wasn't worth the trouble, that getting involved carried risks people weren't willing to take. She didn't blame them exactly. She understood the calculation, but understanding didn't make the isolation sting less. "Cat got your tongue now?" Evan asked, grinning. Against the rising chaos, Junseok remained an island of stillness. While the four men shifted and postured, filling space with movement and noise, he sat motionless except for the slow, deliberate act of eating. His chopsticks moved with precision. His breathing stayed even, his expression unchanged. The contrast was striking, their loud performance versus his quiet presence. They demanded attention. He simply existed. They claimed space through aggression. He occupied it through certainty. Alicia found herself oddly aware of him now, this stranger beside her who seemed utterly unaffected by the tension saturating the air. Most people would have moved away by now, created distance, removed themselves from potential conflict. He stayed. Brandon took another step forward, close enough now that Alicia could smell the cigarette smoke on his clothes. This wasn't accidental proximity anymore. This was a boundary being deliberately crossed, a physical assertion of dominance, a test to see how much space he could claim, how much power he could take. Her heart rate spiked. The familiar cocktail of fear and anger flooded her system, to demanding response, flight or fight, retreat or resist. She'd been here before. She knew what came next, but this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her, Junseok set down his chopsticks with the same measured care he'd shown throughout. Not rushed, not dramatic, just decisive. And for the first time since the harassment began, Alicia felt something shift in the air, a subtle recalibration of power that had nothing to do with volume or numbers. Everything was about to change. Brandon's proximity felt suffocating. Alicia could see the challenge in his eyes, the expectation that she would either shrink back or lash out. Either response would serve his purpose, confirming his power or justifying his escalation. Then a voice cut through the tension, quiet but unmistakable. "Gentlemen?" The word hung in the air, polite and utterly incongruous with the moment. All eyes turned toward the source. Junseok hadn't moved from his seat. His posture remained relaxed, his takeout container still balanced in one hand, but his eyes had lifted from his food, and something in his gaze commanded attention, despite, or perhaps because of, its gentleness. "You're blocking the walkway," he continued, his tone carrying no accusation, merely stating a fact, as one might comment on the weather. Brandon blinked, momentarily thrown off script. "What?" "The walkway," Junseok repeated patiently, gesturing slightly with his chopsticks. "People use it to pass through. Not you're creating an obstruction." The sheer normalcy of the observation, delivered as if he were pointing out a misplaced shopping cart rather than addressing harassment, seemed to confuse Brandon more than anger would have. "Who the hell are you?" Brandon demanded, recovering his aggressive posture. Junseok considered the question as if it genuinely interested him. "Someone enjoying lunch," he replied simply, as this woman was enjoying quiet before you arrived. Tyler laughed, a sharp bark meant to reassert group confidence. Oh, we got a hero here. You gonna save her, old man? I'm not interested in saving anyone, Jun Seok said, his voice maintaining its even keel. I'm suggesting that you respect shared public space. This park belongs to everyone. Your behavior disrupts that. Marcus stepped forward, trying to reclaim dominance through proximity. Man, mind your business. This doesn't concern you. Public harassment concerns everyone present, Jun Seok replied, still not raising his voice. It makes the park unsafe. When the park becomes unsafe, it stops serving its purpose. He paused, taking a deliberate bite of food before continuing. You benefit from safe public spaces too. I assume you'd want others to respect them when you're trying to enjoy peace. The logic was so straightforward, so devoid of moral grandstanding or aggressive posturing, that it seemed to bypass the usual defensive responses. He wasn't calling them criminals or thugs. He was simply pointing out a social contract they themselves relied upon. Evan shifted uncomfortably, the first visible crack in the group's unified front. We were just talking. A man. Talking requires willing participants, Jun Seok observed. She asked to be left alone. That ended the conversation before it began. Brandon's jaw tightened. You think you're smart, using all these big words? I think I'm clear, Jun Seok corrected gently. Clarity and intelligence aren't the same thing. I'm simply naming what's happening. You're making someone uncomfortable in a public space. There's no ambiguity in that. Alicia found herself watching this exchange with growing fascination. Jun Seok wasn't performing masculinity the way Brandon's group was. No puffed chests, no raised voices, no territorial displays. Yet somehow his presence carried more weight. His calm wasn't passive, it was active, intentional, unshakable. Tyler tried mockery again, his go-to weapon. What are you, some kind of park police? You gonna write us a ticket? I don't need authority to observe basic courtesy, Jun Seok replied. Neither do you. That's the advantage of social responsibility. It doesn't require enforcement. It simply requires choice. Marcus scoffed. Man, you talk like a textbook. I talk like someone who understands that order benefits everyone, Jun Seok said. Chaos is exhausting. It costs more energy than simply behaving decently. He set his container down with deliberate care. You're spending considerable effort making someone uncomfortable. To what end? What do you gain that justifies the cost to her peace, to the park's atmosphere, to your own integrity? The question hung in the air, genuine rather than rhetorical. Brandon stared at Jun Seok, and for the first time, something flickered across his face that wasn't bravado or anger. It was uncertainty. This wasn't following any pattern he recognized. People either backed down or fought back. They didn't philosophize. They didn't remain this calm while directly challenging him. There was something off about this man, something Brandon couldn't name but could definitely feel. The way he sat, relaxed but not vulnerable. The way he spoke, gentle but immovable. The way his eyes held steady contact without aggression, but also without a trace of fear. This wasn't an ordinary lunch break office worker. Brandon took an almost imperceptible step backward, his instincts finally catching up to what his pride had been ignoring. Whatever, man, he muttered. But the dismissal sounded hollow. Jun Seok simply nodded, as if accepting the conclusion of a reasonable discussion, and returned his attention to his lunch. But the confrontation wasn't over yet. Brandon's retreat lasted all of 3 seconds before pride reasserted itself. He couldn't walk away, not in front of his friends, not after being lectured by some random guy eating lunch. His reputation, fragile as it was, demanded a response. He stepped forward again, closing the distance aggressively, and jabbed his finger toward Jun Seok's face, inches away, a clear violation of personal space designed to provoke. You got a lot to say for someone sitting on a bench, Brandon snarled. You think talking makes you tough? Jun Seok's eyes dropped to the finger, studied it for a moment as one might examine an interesting insect, then slowly traveled back up to Brandon's face. He didn't flinch, didn't lean back, didn't react with the anger or intimidation the gesture was meant to trigger. And no, he said simply, I think talking prevents unnecessary escalation. Toughness has nothing to do with it. The calm in his voice was almost eerie. Most people, confronted with aggressive finger-pointing and invaded space, would either recoil or push back. Jun Seok did neither. He simply existed in the moment, utterly unbothered. Man, I could knock you out right here, Brandon threatened, his voice rising to compensate for the lack of reaction he was getting. Junseok tilted his head slightly, considering this. You could try, he acknowledged without hostility. But then what? You'd have assaulted someone in a public park, in broad daylight. There are witnesses. Consequences would follow. Would that outcome serve you? It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question, posed with the patience of a teacher helping a student work through a logic problem. Tyler stepped closer to Brandon's shoulder, trying to bolster the group dynamic. Yo, you threatening my boy? I'm describing reality, Junseok replied. Reality isn't a threat, it's simply what is. Actions have consequences. That's not my invention, it's how the world functions. Marcus moved to Brandon's other side, attempting to create an intimidating wall of bodies. You're real brave for someone who could get jumped right now. 3 against 1. You like those odds. For the first time, Junseok's expression shifted slightly, not to fear, but to something that might have been mild disappointment. Numbers don't change principles, he said quietly, and strength in numbers often masks individual weakness. If your position was sound, you wouldn't need reinforcement. Evan Brooks, standing slightly behind the others, shifted his weight uncomfortably. His eyes darted from Junseok to Brandon to the surrounding park. Unlike his companions, he seemed to be actually processing what was happening, and what he was processing was making him increasingly uneasy. This wasn't going the way these things usually went. Alicia watched the dynamics shift in real time. She could see the cracks forming in the group's unified front. Brandon's aggression was becoming more performative, less certain. Marcus's posturing looked forced. Tyler's mockery had lost its edge. And Evan looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The fear that had gripped her moments ago began to loosen, replaced by something unexpected, curiosity. This stranger beside her was dismantling their confidence without raising his voice, without threatening, without doing anything except remaining utterly, unshakably composed. In the distance, sirens wailed, probably unrelated, emergency vehicles heading somewhere else in the city. But the sound punctured the tension like a reminder that the world extended beyond this bench, that authority existed beyond this moment, that consequences were real. Evan heard it too. Man, we should go, he muttered. Shut up, Evan, Brandon snapped, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Junseok wiped his hands with a napkin, the gesture maddeningly casual. Your friend is showing wisdom, he observed. Knowing when to disengage is a valuable skill. Brandon's face flushed. His pride was warring visibly with his instincts, and for a long moment the outcome seemed uncertain. He wanted to escalate, to prove something, to not be the one who backed down. But something about Junseok's stillness, that unnatural, complete calm, kept triggering warning signals Brandon couldn't ignore. This man wasn't posturing, wasn't bluffing, wasn't performing. He was simply immovable, like trying to intimidate a wall. This ain't over, Brandon finally said, the words coming out automatically, a script he'd heard in movies. You better watch yourself. Junseok nodded politely, as if accepting a dinner invitation. I appreciate the advice. The courtesy in his tone somehow made the threat sound even more hollow. Marcus tried to salvage something. Yeah, we'll remember you. I'm sure you will, Junseok replied, without a trace of sarcasm or fear. Brandon stood there a moment longer, trapped by his own tough guy image, desperately wanting the last word, but having nothing left to say that wouldn't sound pathetic against Junseok's unflappable composure. Finally, he turned sharply on his heel. Let's go. This is boring anyway. The 4 men walked away with exaggerated swagger, their laughter loud and forced, shoulders tight with unresolved tension. Every few steps, Brandon glanced back, as if expecting Junseok to react, to gloat, to give him an excuse to re-engage. Junseok simply returned to his lunch, and somehow that was the most devastating response of all. The park exhaled. It was a subtle shift, barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't been sitting at the center of the tension, but Alicia felt it like a physical release. The joggers resumed their steady rhythms. Not a golden retriever bounded past, tongue lolling happily. A child's laugh rang out from the playground. Life, which had seemed to pause during the confrontation, flowed forward again. Normal, safe, ordinary. Alicia's hands, still folded in her lap, began to tremble. The adrenaline that had kept her locked in survival mode now had nowhere to go. It flooded through her system in waves, delayed fear, relief, residual anger, gratitude all tangling together until she couldn't separate one emotion from another. She pressed her palms together harder, trying to stop the shaking, trying to maintain the composure that had become such an essential part of her armor. "It's all right," Junseok said quietly, not looking at her. "The response comes after the threat passes. That's natural." The gentleness in his observation somehow gave her permission to let the facade crack slightly. She exhaled shakily. "Thank you," she managed, her voice unsteady despite her best efforts. "You didn't have to do that." Junseok set down his chopsticks and finally turned to face her fully. His expression was kind, absent of the pity that would have made her defensive or the self-satisfaction that would have made her uncomfortable. "Yes," he said simply, "I did." The certainty in those 3 words struck her. Not "you're welcome" or "it was nothing," both of which would have diminished what had just happened. Instead, he acknowledged the necessity of his intervention as if declining would have been unthinkable. Alicia studied him properly for the first time, really looked at him beyond the crisis that had demanded her attention. Mid-40s, she guessed, Korean, given his features and the subtle accent that shaped certain vowels. His clothes were unremarkable, but well-maintained. His posture suggested someone comfortable in his own skin, unburdened by the need to prove anything. "You weren't scared," she said, the observation emerging as half statement, half question. Junseok considered this, his head tilting slightly as he weighed his response. "Fear is loud," he finally replied. "It announces itself, demands attention, consumes energy. Experience is quiet. It observes, calculates, chooses response over reaction." "That sounds like something you've thought about before." A slight smile touched his lips. "I've had opportunities to consider the difference." Alicia absorbed this, sensing layers beneath the simple words. "What you said to them, about not giving bullies what they want. What did you mean?" Junseok folded the napkin he'd been using, his movements precise and unhurried. "Bullies feed on reaction," he explained. "Fear gives them power. Anger gives them justification. Either response confirms their narrative, that they can control your emotional state, that they matter enough to disrupt your peace." He paused, looking out at the park. "But calm? Calm offers them nothing to consume. It's a closed door they can't force open." "That's easier said than done," Alicia said, hearing the edge of exhaustion in her own voice. "I've been staying calm my whole life. Sometimes it feels like I'm swallowing everything." "There's a difference," Junseok said gently, "between suppressing and choosing. Suppression is internal. You push down what you feel, deny it exists, let it accumulate like pressure in a sealed container. Choice is external. You feel everything, acknowledge it, then decide how to express it in a way that serves you rather than them." Alicia sat with that distinction, turning it over in her mind. "You stayed calm today, but you didn't stay silent." "Exactly," Junseok affirmed. "Silence can be complicity. Calm speech can be resistance. I felt anger at their behavior. Anger is appropriate when witnessing injustice. But I channeled it into clarity rather than volume. The goal wasn't to match their energy, it was to disrupt it." "It worked," Alicia said softly. "I could see them falling apart. Especially the one in the back, Evan." "Fear of consequence is powerful," Junseok observed. "More powerful than fear of confrontation." He understood that their behavior had costs they might actually have to pay. That understanding fractured their group courage. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching an elderly couple walk past hand in hand, completely unaware of the small drama that had unfolded on this bench. Alicia realized something had shifted inside her, not just relief that the confrontation had ended, but something deeper. This stranger had seen her vulnerable and hadn't made her smaller for it. He'd intervened without claiming ownership of her problem, without demanding gratitude or recognition. He'd simply done what needed doing. "I should go," she said, gathering her bag but finding herself reluctant to leave. "But I'm glad you were here, really glad." Junseok looked up at her, and something in his eyes suggested he understood more than she'd said. "So am I." As Alicia stood and walked away from the bench, she felt different than when she'd arrived, lighter somehow, as if the weight she'd been carrying, the exhausting burden of constant vigilance, of always being the calm one, had been witnessed and acknowledged. She didn't know his name, didn't know anything about him beyond this brief intersection of their lives, but she knew she'd remember him, and she knew that something about how she saw herself, and what she deserved, had quietly, permanently changed. Junseok sat alone on the bench, the empty space beside him still warm from where Alicia had been moments before. His takeout container was nearly finished now, and just a few pieces of pickled radish remaining. He ate them slowly, methodically, his chopsticks moving with the same precise economy they'd maintained throughout the entire encounter. To any casual observer, nothing about him would suggest he'd just defused a volatile situation. He looked exactly as he had an hour ago, unremarkable, peaceful, forgettable, exactly as he preferred. He'd learned long ago that visibility carried costs most people never considered. To be noticed was to be remembered. To be remembered was to leave traces. And traces, in his world, created vulnerabilities, connections that could be exploited, patterns that could be tracked, weaknesses that could be targeted. Anonymity wasn't a limitation. It was a strategy. Still, there were moments when invisibility had to be sacrificed. Moments when walking away would cost more than intervening. He'd developed a calculus over the years, a mental framework for determining when action was necessary versus when it was merely tempting. The question he always asked himself, what breaks if I do nothing? Today, the answer had been clear. A woman's safety, the park's social fabric, the basic principle that shared spaces required shared responsibility. Those things, in his assessment, were worth the minor exposure of speaking up. Junseok watched a sparrow land near his feet, pecking optimistically at the ground for crumbs. The bird had no concept of hierarchy, of power structures, of the complex negotiations humans engaged in constantly. It simply existed, responding to immediate needs without the burden of strategy or consequence. Sometimes he envied that simplicity. His life had been built on the opposite principle. Everything was strategy. Every action carried consequence. Every word was weighed against potential futures. It wasn't dramatic work, despite what movies suggested. It was meticulous, exhausting, a constant exercise in restraint. Managing people, he'd told Alicia, helping them make better decisions. Both statements were true. Neither was complete. The people he managed operated in contexts where poor decisions didn't just mean lost opportunities. They meant broken families, shattered lives, cascading violence. His role was to create structure where chaos threatened, to build systems that discouraged the worst impulses while protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It required a particular kind of authority, the kind that didn't announce itself with violence or spectacle, but with consistency, fairness, and the quiet certainty that consequences would follow actions as reliably as night followed day. Discipline over dominance, order over intimidation. The men who'd harassed Alicia had been performing power, all noise and display, aggression as theater. They'd probably walk away convinced they'd chosen to leave, that they'd made the decision rather than having it made for them. Junseok preferred it that way. Let them keep their pride. Pride was harmless as long as it didn't manifest in harm to others. Real power, he'd learned, worked best when people didn't realize it had been applied. Like good architecture or well-designed systems, it should be invisible in its operation, noticed only when absent. Around him, the park continued its afternoon rhythm. A young mother pushed a stroller past, and talking softly to her baby. Two teenagers threw a frisbee, their laughter carrying on the breeze. An elderly man fed pigeons from a paper bag, ignoring the signs requesting he didn't. Normal life, small moments, the kind of peaceful ordinariness that required constant, invisible maintenance to preserve. Most people never thought about that maintenance. They enjoyed safe parks and orderly streets without considering the countless small interventions, by individuals, by systems, by people choosing engagement over apathy, that made such safety possible. Junseok thought about it constantly. It was both his burden and his purpose. He finished the last piece of radish, closed his container, and stood. His movements were unhurried, economical. He gathered his trash, deposited it in a nearby receptacle, and adjusted his jacket with the same measured precision he brought to everything. Work, despite what movies suggested. It was meticulous, exhausting, a constant exercise in restraint. Managing people, he'd told Alicia, helping them make better decisions. Both statements were true. Neither was complete. The people he managed operated in contexts where poor decisions didn't just mean lost opportunities. They meant broken families, shattered lives, cascading violence. His role was to create structure where chaos threatened, to build systems that discourage the worst impulses while protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It required a particular kind of authority, the kind that didn't announce itself with violence or spectacle, but with consistency, fairness, and the quiet certainty that consequences would follow actions as reliably as night followed day. Discipline over dominance, order over intimidation. The men who'd harassed Alicia had been performing power. All noise and display, aggression as theater. They'd probably walk away convinced they'd chosen to leave, that they'd made the decision rather than having it made for them. Jun Seok preferred it that way. Let them keep their pride. Pride was harmless as long as it didn't manifest in harm to others. Real power, he'd learned, worked best when people didn't realize it had been applied. Like good architecture or well-designed systems, it should be invisible in its operation, noticed only when absent. Around him, the park continued its afternoon rhythm. A young mother pushed a stroller past, talking softly to her baby. Two teenagers threw a frisbee, their laughter carrying on the breeze. An elderly man fed pigeons from a paper bag, ignoring the signs requesting he didn't. Normal life. Small moments, the kind of peaceful ordinariness that required constant, invisible maintenance to preserve. Most people never thought about that maintenance. They enjoyed safe parks and orderly streets without considering the countless small interventions, by individuals, by systems, by people choosing engagement over apathy, that made such safety possible. Jun Seok thought about it constantly. It was both his burden and his purpose. He finished the last piece of radish, closed his container, and stood. His movements were unhurried, economical. He gathered his trash, deposited it in a nearby receptacle, and adjusted his jacket with the same measured precision he brought to everything. Before leaving, he glanced once more at the bench where he'd sat. No evidence remained of what had transpired there. No disturbance, no disruption, and nothing to suggest the quiet confrontation that had reshaped at least one person's afternoon. Perfect. Jun Seok walked away from the bench, merging seamlessly into the flow of park visitors. Within moments, he was indistinguishable from the crowd. Another face in the afternoon traffic, anonymous and unremarkable. A jogger passed through the space he'd just occupied. A couple sat on the bench, oblivious to its recent history. The park absorbed his absence without acknowledgement, continuing its gentle rhythm as if he'd never been there at all, which was precisely how he preferred it. Because the most effective power, Jun Seok knew, was the kind nobody saw coming. And the most successful intervention was the one people forgot to credit. He disappeared into the city, carrying his secrets with the same quiet care he'd carried his lunch. On unseen, unnoticed, unremembered, exactly as intended. They made it 2 blocks before the forced laughter died completely. Brandon led the group down the street with exaggerated swagger, hands shoved deep in his pockets, jaw tight. Behind him, Tyler and Marcus followed, with matching false bravado, their voices too loud, their jokes too forced. Evan trailed behind, silent, his earlier unease now fully settled into something heavier. "Man, that dude was crazy," Tyler announced to no one in particular, his laugh brittle and unconvincing. "Talking all that philosophical nonsense like he's some kind of professor or something." "For real," Marcus agreed quickly, too quickly. "Who even talks like that? Dude watches too many movies." Brandon said nothing. His silence felt different from his usual commanding presence, less controlled, and more contained, like pressure building behind a dam. Tyler noticed and tried to fill the void. "We should have just handled him, taught him to mind his business." "Yeah?" Evan spoke for the first time since they'd left the park, his voice flat. "And then what? Get arrested for assault in broad daylight? Real smart." Tyler bristled. "I'm just saying we didn't have to walk away like that. Made us look soft." "We didn't look soft," Marcus jumped in defensively. "We chose to leave. That's different. We were bored anyway." "Right," Evan said, the single word heavy with skepticism. Brandon stopped walking abruptly, and the others nearly collided with him. He turned, his face flushed with anger that had been simmering since they'd left the bench. "Shut up," he snapped. "All of you. Just shut up." The group fell silent, exchanging glances. They'd seen Brandon angry before. Anger was his default setting, the fuel that powered most of his interactions. But this felt different. This wasn't directed outward at a target. This was something turned inward, something gnawing at him. "We should have stayed," Brandon said finally, his voice low and tight. "Should have made him back down." How? Evan asked, genuinely curious now. Nothing we said affected him. Nothing we did shook him. So how exactly would we have made him back down? Brandon's hands clenched into fists. We had numbers, 4 against 1. And he didn't care, Evan continued, something almost wondering in his tone. That's what I don't get. He should have cared. People always care when they're outnumbered. But him? It was like our numbers didn't even register. Like we were... He trailed off, researching for the word. Irrelevant, Marcus finished quietly, voicing what they had all felt, but none had wanted to acknowledge. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Brandon felt it like a punch to the gut. That moment on the bench when Jun Seok's eyes had met his, utterly calm, utterly unimpressed. No fear, no respect, not even anger, just patience. Like Brandon was a child throwing a tantrum that would eventually exhaust itself. He'd pointed his finger in the man's face, had threatened him, had postured with 3 friends backing him up, and none of it had mattered. For Brandon, whose entire identity was built on intimidation, on being the one who made others uncomfortable, the reversal felt like standing on suddenly unstable ground. His power had always come from other people's reactions, their fear, their deference, armoring their retreat, but Jun Seok hadn't given him any of those things, had offered nothing to push against, no fear to feed on, no anger to escalate with. It was like throwing punches at fog. That dude was weird, Tyler tried again, desperately wanting to restore the normal order where they were the dominant force in any encounter. Probably had issues or something. Yeah, Marcus agreed. Definitely something off about him. But the words sounded hollow even to them. They were trying to rewrite what had happened, to transform their retreat into a reasonable response to someone unstable rather than an admission that they'd been outmatched. Evan shook his head slowly. He wasn't weird. He was just different. Like he operated on a whole different level than us. What's that supposed to mean? Brandon demanded. Evan met his eyes directly. It means we're used to people being scared or getting angry. We know how to work with that. But calm, real calm, not fake calm, we got nothing for that. Our whole thing falls apart when someone just doesn't react. The truth of it settled over the group like cold water. Brandon turned away, staring at the street without really seeing it. He'd walked away from that bench, and while he'd convinced himself it was his choice, some part of him knew better. Some part recognized that Jun Seok had controlled that entire interaction from beginning to end, had guided them toward leaving without ever raising his voice or issuing a direct threat. That man had sat on a bench eating lunch and somehow made 4 of them feel powerless. The realization tasted like failure. Next time, Brandon started. There's not going to be a next time, Evan interrupted. And if there is, I'm out. I'm not trying to test someone like that again. Tyler and Marcus exchanged glances but said nothing. Their silence was agreement enough. Brandon stood alone in his anger, feeling the group's cohesion fracture around him. The power structure he'd relied on, the confidence that came from numbers, from intimidation, from making people smaller, had cracked against something he didn't understand, and he hated not understanding. But more than that, he hated the small, insistent voice in his head that kept replaying Jun Seok's words, "I think you scare yourself." Alicia sat in her small apartment that evening, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, untouched. The window was open, letting in the ambient sounds of the city, traffic, distant conversations, and the rhythmic thump of music from a neighbor's apartment. Normal sounds, safe sounds. But her mind was still in the park. She'd come home hours ago, had gone through the motions of her evening routine, changed clothes, started dinner, responded to texts, but part of her remained on that bench, replaying the encounter frame by frame, examining it from angles she couldn't access while it was happening. The fear had been real. She could acknowledge that now, in the safety of her own space. Her hands had trembled, her heart had raced. Every instinct had screamed at her to run, to escape, to remove herself from danger. But she hadn't run. She'd stayed. She'd spoken calmly. She'd refused to give them the reaction they were seeking. And then, unexpectedly, miraculously, help had arrived. Alicia picked up her phone. I scrolled through her messages without really reading them, then set it down again. She kept returning to the same question. What had she learned today? The easy answer was about strangers and intervention, about good people who step up when needed. But that felt incomplete, like describing a painting by listing its colors while missing the composition entirely. The real lesson, she was beginning to understand, went deeper. For years, Alicia had conflated silence with self-preservation. She'd learned to swallow her anger, to suppress her frustration, to perform calm even when rage burned inside her. She told herself this was strength, the ability to endure without breaking, to maintain composure in the face of disrespect. But Junseok had shown her something different. He hadn't been silent. He'd spoken clearly, directly, and now without apology or aggression. He'd named what was happening: harassment, intimidation, violation of shared space, without raising his voice or matching their energy. His calm wasn't suppression, it was choice. His restraint wasn't weakness, it was strategy. There's a difference between suppressing and choosing, he'd said. Alicia stood and walked to her window, looking out at the street below. A woman walked past, phone to her ear, laughing at something. Two men stood outside a bodega, sharing a cigarette and conversation. Life continuing, ordinary and unremarkable. She thought about all the times she'd stayed silent when she wanted to speak, all the moments she'd swallowed disrespect in the name of avoiding conflict, all the instances where she'd convinced herself that enduring was the same as winning. What if she'd been wrong? What if true strength wasn't about bearing everything alone, but about knowing when to accept help, not waiting for rescue? She hadn't been passive today, but recognizing that allies, even unexpected ones, could shift impossible situations into manageable ones. Junseok hadn't saved her. He'd stood beside her. There was a crucial difference. She'd been taught, explicitly and implicitly, that asking for help was weakness, that strong black women handled their problems independently, that vulnerability was dangerous, a crack in the armor that others would exploit. But today she'd seen a different model: strength that acknowledged limits, calm that invited support, dignity that didn't require isolation. Alicia returned to her chair, picking up the tea and taking a sip despite its coolness. The incident was reshaping something fundamental in how she understood safety. Safety, she'd always believed, came from making herself smaller, less noticeable, less threatening, less present, from managing others' comfort at the expense of her own, from performing a version of herself that might, if she was careful enough, avoid becoming a target. But Junseok had protected her by doing the opposite, by making himself present, by refusing to ignore what was happening, by claiming space rather than yielding it. This woman asked to be left alone. That should have ended the conversation. He'd said it so simply, as if her request carried inherent authority that required no justification, as if her comfort in a public space mattered as much as anyone else's, as if she deserved dignity, not because she'd earned it through perfect behavior, but because she was human and present. When was the last time she'd believed that about herself? Alicia felt something shift in her chest, not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet recalibration, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she'd been carrying weights that weren't hers to carry, that the exhaustion she felt wasn't just from today's encounter, but from years of making herself responsible for others' bad behavior. She thought about tomorrow, about the inevitable moments when she'd navigate public spaces again, the subway, the grocery store, the park, perhaps. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the thought didn't fill her with preemptive dread. She wouldn't be reckless, wouldn't abandon the caution that had kept her safe. But maybe, she could stop treating every public space like a minefield she had to tiptoe through. Maybe she could walk with her head up. Maybe she could trust that if something happened, she had the right to name it, to resist it, to expect others to care. Alicia stood, carrying her cup to the sink. She looked at her reflection in the darkening window. Tired eyes, familiar face, but something different in her expression. Confidence. Not the false bravado she sometimes performed, but genuine, earned confidence. She'd survived today, more than survived. She'd maintained her dignity while under attack, had accepted help without shame, had witnessed firsthand that calm authority could dismantle aggression more effectively than force. Tomorrow, she'd carry those lessons with her, and the day after that, and the day after that, and until reclaiming space felt like a right rather than a risk. 3 days later, Junseok returned to Riverside Green Park. He carried the same black jacket, the same quiet demeanor, the same takeout container from a Korean restaurant 2 blocks away. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees with identical golden warmth, casting the same long shadows across the same walking paths. Everything looked exactly as it had before. He chose a different bench this time. not deliberately avoiding the previous one, simply selecting what was available. An elderly woman sat at the far end, feeding sparrows. A young father pushed his daughter on a nearby swing, her delighted squeals punctuating the afternoon air. Jun Seok opened his container and began to eat, his movements unhurried and methodical. To anyone watching, and no one was, he appeared exactly as he'd appeared 3 days ago. Unremarkable, peaceful, forgettable. Just another person taking a lunch break in a public park, enjoying a brief respite from whatever responsibilities filled his day. The park had no memory of what had happened here. No plaque commemorated the confrontation. No witnesses pointed and whispered about the bench where a woman had been harassed and a stranger had intervened. The space had absorbed the incident and moved on, continuing its purpose, providing rest, beauty, community. Jun Seok preferred it this way. He'd received no recognition for his intervention. No one had approached him to say thank you again, to ask his name, to praise his courage. Alicia had left, and he'd resumed his anonymous existence as if nothing had occurred. This was how real protection worked, he believed, not through spectacle or reputation, not through stories told and retold until they became legend, but through small, unglamorous choices made in moments when no one was keeping score. A jogger passed, nearly the same time as 3 days ago, following the same route. The rhythm of the park was returning, reliable and constant. This consistency, this predictable safety that allowed people to exercise, rest, and exist without fear, required constant, invisible maintenance. Most people never thought about that maintenance. They simply enjoyed its fruits. Jun Seok thought about it constantly. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the message, a business matter requiring his attention later today, someone needing guidance on a decision with complex ramifications, the kind of work he did every day, navigating conflicts that could escalate into violence if not handled with precision and care. This was his real power, the ability to de-escalate, to create structures where people's worst impulses were discouraged and their better instincts rewarded. Not through domination, but through consistency. Not through fear, but through fairness. It was exhausting work, unglamorous work. Work that succeeded when nothing dramatic happened, when potential disasters quietly failed to materialize. The world celebrated visible heroism. The firefighter who ran into burning buildings, the officer who caught the criminal, the activist who gave the rousing speech. And those people deserved celebration. But Jun Seok had learned to find meaning in the invisible victories, the fights that never happened because wise intervention prevented them, and in the harm that never occurred because someone chose restraint, the dignity that remained intact because another person decided that protecting it mattered. These victories left no scars, generated no stories, created no legends. They simply allowed life to continue, peaceful and ordinary. A mother walked past with a stroller, completely at ease, trusting in the park's safety without conscious thought. She would never know that 3 days ago, this trust had been tested and defended, would never know that a stranger's quiet intervention had helped preserve the space's integrity. Jun Seok watched her pass and felt satisfied. This was success, a park where people felt safe, where a mother could walk without fear, where harassment was interrupted rather than ignored, where the social contract of shared public space remained intact. And not because of dramatic confrontation or violent justice, but because someone had chosen to speak calmly when silence would have been easier. He finished his lunch and closed the container. The sparrows that had been pecking near the elderly woman's feet scattered briefly, then returned. A cloud drifted across the sun, temporarily cooling the air before passing. The father lifted his daughter from the swing, both of them laughing. Ordinary moments, strung together like beads on an invisible thread. This was what power looked like when it served protection rather than domination, when it defended rather than conquered, when it created space for others to exist peacefully rather than demanding recognition for itself. Jun Seok stood, gathered his trash, and deposited it in the nearby receptacle with the same careful precision he brought to everything. He adjusted his jacket, checked his phone once more, and began walking toward the park's exit. As he left, the park continued without him, the swing still swaying gently, the sparrows still pecking, the paths still welcoming whoever chose to walk them. No one marked his departure. No one would remember he'd been there at all, which was exactly as it should be. Because the most important power, Jun Seok knew, was the kind that needed no witnesses, the kind that worked in silence, protected without fanfare, and measured success not in recognition received, but in harm prevented. Real strength didn't announce itself. It simply showed up when needed, did what was necessary, and disappeared back into ordinary life, leaving dignity intact. And leaving safety preserved, leaving the world quietly, imperceptibly better than it found it. And that, Jun-seok believed as he merged into the city's flow and became once again invisible among the crowd, was the only power worth having.